Good morning, everyone. Thank you to everyone that's tuning in to this morning's webinar, our updated supply, demand, and price prospects for corn and soybeans. I'm Scott Irwin, and I'm here with my partner in crime this morning, Todd Hubbs.
Good morning, everyone.
And we're going to get rolling. All right, here we go. Figure one here is, what was the shocker to Todd and I, and as we'll see in a moment, to the market. USDA reported with their resurvey for the August crop production report, which was released yesterday, that we planted 90 million acres of corn in the U.S. this spring, and that's up 0.9 million acres from 2018. And as the map shows, as we look across the Corn Belt, there's some really surprising numbers. Terrifically wet conditions in, for example, South Dakota. Their acreage versus last year was down only 300,000. No change in Iowa as we move from west to east. Illinois, despite extraordinarily delayed wet planting conditions, down only 300,000. Indiana down 400,000. Ohio 500. Michigan 300,000. So that's the story across the broad swath of the Corn Belt. And that obviously is causing a lot of people to question the accuracy of that 90 million acre figure, Todd.
Yeah.
And we're just going to come out and say, after the evaluation we've done since the report was released, here's our bottom line. We think that the data indicate that these numbers should be considered close. We probably think that we'll see a bit of drifting down in the acreage numbers as the planted and the harvested as we go forward, but probably no more than 1 to 2 million acres due to a variety of issues that people have been raising. So why do we, in essence, think that these numbers are right? And that's found in this table. Basically, what we're going to show here is that the numbers really do add up in a sensible way, given the numbers. So let's start with corn. What we show for corn is that we planted 89.1. The PP there stands for prevent plant. And we had prevent plant of 900,000 acres in 18, so that totaled 90 million acres. In 2019, we planted 90 million. Prevent plant was huge, multiples of our previous record, as we expected.
Yep.
So Todd and I had been expecting prevent plant on corn to be between 10 and 15 million acres since late May. And that came in as expected. What was the shocking part was that we did both huge prevent plant and maintained a large base of corn acres, so that the total expanded to over 101 million acres. And talk about that in a minute. That totals up 11.2 million acres. Todd and I didn't think that farmers would do both as much as they did. Now let's go to soybeans. What we see there is that planted acreage in 2019 is down by 12.5 million acres. And prevent plant is up 4.1, so that the total of prevent plant and what was planted in soybeans was off 8.4 million acres. Finally, look at that corn and soybeans combined total. And what you see, go down to the very last line, is that the sum across both crops basically makes sense. The sum of corn and soybean planted acreage in PP in 2018 was 179.5 million acres. And in 2019, it was 182.3 million. And it's really the distribution across that, though, that's so surprising. We did find almost 3 million acres of that base for corn and soybeans, and that's why we think that there's some small scope for the total of planted corn acreage and harvested to go down maybe 1 million or 2 because of that discrepancy. But the overall picture is basically what happened is we kept the intended base of actual corn planted acreage roughly constant, basically flat, and took a huge chunk of soybean acres as prevent plant on corn. and that's how we basically kept the total between the two crops about the same. You got any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I did not expect as we came into June that the decision to be made based on the agronomics, I understand the price difference that was going on in June, that we would see when you're sitting there looking in early into mid-June, I'm going to plant corn, not soybeans, basically, and PP these acres. So yeah, basically it looks like corn PP stole soybean acres and you went ahead and planted corn.
In June.
And I thought there was a scope for some of that, but not at the magnitude that it ended up being.
Basically, what this tells us is that someplace between 38 and 40 million acres of corn were planted basically in June.
And a good chunk of that in late June.
From basically June 10th to June 24th. And, we knew that there would be a lot of corn that would have to go in June. We knew that, but I expected the amount obviously to be like 5 million acres less, and that we would have had more prevent plant. It's really interesting given, for example, Illinois is a perfect case study of what happened.
Yeah.
We were sitting in a situation where, we had roughly 2/3 of the corn left to plant after May 26th, and we planted virtually all of it.
We PP'd 1.2 million acres.
And we own, 1 million acres of PP is a lot, but given how most of the crop had to be planted in June, Todd and I both expected that PP in Illinois would be twice what it was.
Yeah.
And you look at it throughout the Eastern Corn Belt, even though they are big totals for PP, Todd and I actually thought that they would be 3-4 million acres higher in the Eastern Corn Belt than they turned out to be.
I definitely thought so. I didn't expect corn to go in that late in these magnitudes. I thought some of it would happen, particularly with producers that didn't have crop insurance. And, there's a variety of factors, but to see, or on county, but to see that kind of acreage go in that late, we'll see how it turns out.
My view is I asked myself, how did I get it wrong? Because I believe that I got it wrong because I'm going to take these USDA numbers as adding up, and this is, for now, the best information we have about what happened. I think it must be so the really interesting market question to struggle with is, why did all those acres get put in June? And I think it had to be a combination of price expectations that were more bullish than the market prices that were being offered at the time. And I think this is a critical one that we're going to get a really interesting test on this year. And that is, what is the yield penalty for planting corn from early to late June? The agronomic data, indicates that should be a severe penalty.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like farmers' behavior, was consistent with an expectation of those kind of severe yield penalties. We'll see. Farmers could end up being right, but that's going to be a critical issue as we go through the rest of our outlook.
Yes, it is.
So let's keep rolling before I run us out of time. All right. So where are we at in terms of yield? on the corn balance sheet. This linear trend gives us a trend yield of 173.2. The USDA is higher at around 176. Going into the report, the average trade guess was 164.9. USDA surprised us by being roughly 5 bushels above that. That was another major surprise to the market. And I'll have comments about that as we move through. We are quite skeptical of a yield that high. Again, because now we know that 40 to 45% of our corn crop was put in essentially in June. And, a 169.5 is only roughly a 7 bushel drop, or about what you said, 4%.
It's about 4%. I don't see how. I just don't believe that. That the amount of corn that went in June and the only fade yield 4% seems optimistic.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get lucky like
right?
that. But the agronomics data on planting dates would suggest, man, we really got lucky with the weather. Did we really get that lucky with the weather?
I don't feel lucky. I'm going to tell you that right now.
I definitely don't feel lucky this morning. So we're going to see. We're going to fade that yield number because of so much of the crop was planted so late. Here's what those trend deviations in corn look like. Going back to the early 90s, and you can see we had 5 great crops relative to trend starting in 2014. And in terms of bushels per acre, given that linear trend, we were looking only about a 4.3 bushel drop from that linear trend that presented. It'd be a little bit bigger drop from the USDA's trend, but you can see that given the lateness of the planting, that just seems like that's a little bit optimistic compared to other years when we've had some significant production problems.
In particular, I'd like to point out 93 and 95, which is they're being considered comparable years to the kind of weather pattern we had this year. Really wet in the spring. And we saw some pretty significant yield deviations in those years. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen this year, but this is a similar kind of year to that when you hear people talking about the kind of weather we've had.
And if you take those kind of late planted years, there was not nearly as much planted in June as we did this year.
No, not nearly.
So corn yield by state, again, USDA was forecasting some very significant drops relative to last year. Illinois down 29 bushels, Indiana down 23 bushels, Ohio down 27. But there were some kind of strange numbers there as well. Michigan up 2 relative to last year. Wisconsin only down 7. Iowa only down 5 bushels from last year. And I think that's going to be a big one moving forward. Is Iowa really going to be in the 190s this year? So basically, while the USDA was factoring in some significant yield drops, our expectation is that when we get to the final yields, that they'll actually be even more yield drops than what's shown on this chart, is basically what our position is. So in terms of production, the USDA came in at 13.9 billion bushels, which was dramatically higher than the average trade guess of roughly 13.2 billion. Yeah. So put that together, we had a 707 million bushel bearish surprise, which dwarfs anything of the last 20 years for the August crop report when you combine the bearish surprise on acreage and yield. So that is why the markets have taken a huge tumble. Basically, we're in the process of taking close to 10% off the market price.
Yes, we are.
So now, looking forward, again, Todd and I's position is that largely we believe the acreage story is over. We think we could drift down a little due to things like maybe some confusion in reporting silage and cover crop acreage, but the really bullish scenario in acreage we think is off the table now.
I do.
So
Yeah.
it's all going to come down to yield if we're going to get some price recovery from our current depressed levels. And you can see that there's a wide range of revisions to the August corn yield estimate. We can go back historically. It's increased by as much as 11.5 bushels and decreased by as much as 12 bushels an acre. So we haven't seen really big changes like that in recent years, but those kind of changes tend to come under less than perfect growing seasons. And so we think that there is still scope for one of the larger downward revisions in corn yields of the last 20 years.
I do. I think that we'll see how it all plays out, and when there's still weather to go. But yeah, I think you could see that come down.
And so, there is room for that to happen, and we think that it will. Again, like I said, we think that we're now back in a situation where the changes to harvested acres of corn compared to what we have with the resurvey in August will be in this kind of normal historical range, which typically is plus or minus 1 million acres. For the U.S. might be a little bit bigger than that, but that's what we think we're looking at. All right, let's kind of quickly go through some use statistics on corn. We need to reach, in order to reach the USDA's forecast, which they dropped yesterday by 25 million bushels of 54.25. You can see what we need to see for July and August corn use for ethanol production, and we think we're on track for that. Exports, we think they're even going to be a little bit softer than the USDA's current projections. The USDA production is 2.1 billion bushels, and total to date is a little under 2 billion. And we need to step up the pace in order to meet that USDA projection. Fourth quarter feed and residual use of corn, in order to hit the USDA's current 5450 target, we need in the fourth quarter to be 681, and we think that that's very doable. So when we look at the old crop balance sheet for 2018-19, you can see no change from what you see is what was in the August WASDE yesterday in the left column, and the right column is where we're at. Exactly the same on supply. And we are the same in terms of the consumption side, except we're a little bit more bearish on where exports are going to end up. We're at 2060 instead of 2100, which puts us at exactly a carryout of 2.4 billion bushels with an ending stocks to use ratio of 16.9%. So just slightly softer than where the USDA came out yesterday, but not really a notable change. Obviously, the big news is where do you come out with the new crop balance sheet after yesterday? And it obviously looks much more bearish than we expected. The first column is the USDA's own estimates from yesterday, and you can see at 90 million planted and 82 million harvested with a yield of 169.5. The USDA came in with total production of 13.9 million with ending stocks of 2360, gives them a total supply of 16,311. And you can see the feed and residual for next year and ethanol that the USDA was using, giving them, when you put it all together, an ending stocks of 2.181 billion bushels, and a stocks to use ratio of 15.4%, basically putting us into a price scenario where we've been in recent years.
Exactly. Flat.
Just flat. Now, what about where do we come out? And our main differences, again, are yield, because Todd and I's view is the 169.5 is going to have to be proven to us, given that 45% of the corn crop was planted in June. We think that if we can eke out a yield basically of 170 bushels an acre, that's going to be such a significant data point if such a significant data point about the trend yields for our hybrids, if we can plant them that late, that we'll actually believe we'll have to revise our trend models if we get a yield that high. So you can see we're putting up scenarios that bound where we're at personally on yields right now. We're at 160 at the low side and the high side 166. And you can see that gives us a crop between 13.6 and 13.1 is what we think with the current acreage base. And we fiddle around a little bit under those two scenarios with our use forecast. You can see those there. And so under a 166 yield, we come in at ending stocks of essentially 2 billion bushels and a quarter higher on price if that happens of 385. And if we get the really low yield scenario, that puts us down about 1.6 billion bushels, ending stock to use of 11.2%. And we think that would still give us an annual average price above $4, perhaps as high as 4.25.
Yeah, it could be. It looks optimistic right now based on where the prices are going, but there's a lot of yield information still to come in on this crop here.
That's right. I mean, we still have, unprecedented early frost risks that we have to walk through, even if the crop really is a 169.5 right now. So there's a lot of scope for the yield story yet to emerge. So bottom line, we're accepting the USDA acreage numbers, and we now think it's a yield story. Todd, take us to soybeans.
All right. Oh, here we got these crop basis.
Oh,
here, I got this. So what we saw for corn crop basis, and this is out of South Central Illinois, they've been strengthening over the marketing year. And this is on an average. Some have been stronger, some have been weaker, but around 18 cents under. You might see this weaken a little bit based on this report, but depending on what the yields do, you could see it being flat or strengthening a little bit as we move into the next marketing year, particularly in the Eastern Corn Belt, where I think some serious production problems are underway. So you could see basis strength through the marketing year. Nothing like we were looking at if we did 85 million acres on a 160, right? That report yesterday probably took the dreams of $5 are gone, in my opinion. Scott, you can disagree.
I agree 100%.
Yeah. This is from yesterday. We've lost another 13 cents out of corn. There's basically carry in the market there. There's a lot of concern about folks missing old crop pricing opportunities in July for corn. My suggestion is right now I would not be wait and see where this, if you have the time to wait and see and you have the storage availability to see where this goes when we get into September and as some of these yield reports start coming in. It's never a good idea to market it, I don't think, immediately after such a huge shock. You get a little bit of overreaction. We'll see how it goes as we move forward. Scott, you might have opinions on that. This thing's down another 10 cents across the board, but they're still carrying the market. Soybeans. As Scott said, we planted 76.7 million acres of soybeans in 2019. That's down 12.5 million acres from 2018. And most of the Corn Belt states are no change or down from the June report, with the exception of Iowa and Indiana. I still don't know what's going on over in Indiana this year. There's a lot of weird information coming out of that state.
That's Indiana.
Indiana. But that's supportive of soybean prices. There's not been a lot of talk, and we'll talk about a little bit in a minute about the soybean crop in particular and the yield potential there. But we could eat through a bunch of this 1.07 billion bushels of carryout in 18-19 pretty easily under this lower acreage scenario. Looking at yield, USDA is at 48.5, slightly below this quadratic trend. And much like in corn, despite just the vast number of acres that went 2/3 of the soybean crop, possibly.
Right.
That went in June, a lot of it late in June. Much like in corn, we're going to see about these new hybrids. And is this feasible? It's basically a little bit of a 4% drop from last year. I'm lower than this yield by a couple of bushels at minimum.
Right, because we're looking at roughly, by our calculations, somewhere around 50 million acres of soybeans went in sometime in June.
It's a huge number out of 76.7. When we look at soybean trend deviations, we've seen some pretty good deviations in trend yield. The last few years, we've been above trend. Great crops we've had. This year, we're slightly down. We look at soybean yields by state, and this is where the details, I think, may matter. We're down 10 bushels from last year's massive 65 bushels an acre in Illinois. They're down 8.5 in Indiana and down 10 in Ohio. That all makes a lot of sense considering how the crop went in. The question is, are those numbers even too high? Depending on what we're seeing this year. Iowa's only down 2. I don't know about you, Scott. I've heard reports out of Iowa that tend to say that crop's not doing all that well this year. We'll see. We'll see. Strangely, we got record yields in Kentucky and Tennessee this year. Now, they did get a lot of timely rain through late June and early July, and they've got good crops going, but they're not going to decide this market. The heart of the Corn Belt will decide it, and we'll see as we move through September and into harvest. Soybean production, the USDA pegged it at 3.68 billion bushels, which is lower than the trade guess at 3.8, basically on acreage. They didn't change the yield at all from the July WASDA report. So that drop in acreage, lower production across the board. When we look at the production forecast minus the average trade guess, this was also a bit of a positive shock of 120 million bushels, the largest in the last 20-some years. Unlike the last few years where we've seen the production be way above what everybody thought. And that's sort of getting reflected in the new crop soybean prices today. I think it's somewhat positive for soybeans. When we look at the final yield estimate minus the August forecast, the USDA has done a pretty good job of this over the years. Now, they've been a little low the last few years. The yield's gotten higher as we've gone along, but there have been times where we've seen a substantial drop from the final to August, but it's rarely been outside of 3 bushels an acre. Now, having said that, if there's going to be a year for this to happen, I think this is the year.
Right.
Because they're at 48.5. It just seems unbelievable to me as late as the soybean crop went in this year through the heart of the Corn Belt. But we'll see. You got anything on that?
No, I mean, I just think it comes down to we're going to find out what yield penalties really are for planting crops in June. Yeah. And maybe we've been overestimating. That's basically what the USDA is assuming.
Yep. Harvested acres minus the August forecast. USDA is usually, they do a pretty good job of doing this. You'll see sometimes above a million acres come out of it. Could we see that again this year? Maybe. We're 4.4 million acres of prevent plant for soybeans this year. Will that creep up over time? It could. In some of these years where you see this big change in harvested acres minus August forecast, those are some pretty big PP years, particularly out in the northern plains for soybeans. So we'll see. I think they're pretty close right now. So when we think about the 2018-19 crop year, right now the USDA is projecting 1.7 billion bushels. We're at about 1.62 billion bushels to date. We got 252 million bushels of unshipped sales. You have to remember, over 100 million of that's to China. I don't see that getting taken out. It could. We've been doing about 33.1 million bushels a week. We need about 25. I think we're on pace to hit that number. It may go a little, it may go over, but since China's sitting over on over 100 million of those bushels, it should be close, I think, to 1.7 billion. Crush, the USDA lowered crush another 20 million bushels in this report. We need about 165 million bushels a month from July and August to hit their current projection. I think this is close to right. It could fade a little bit more, but I don't think it will. So we'll see where crush ends up in the 18-19 marketing year. So overall, on the 18-19 balance sheet, we're the same as the USDA. Same supply numbers, 4.999 billion bushels of supply in 1819 with a 3.9 billion bushel consumption, which puts ending stocks at 1.07 billion bushels or 27.2% stocks to use, an 840 average farm price. You know, as we moved into the last fall, you could sort of see this coming with the trade problems we had. And it's really showing up in exports at 1.7 billion bushels. And I know there's a lot of speculation on trade right now. I don't see a resolution of this trade impasse as we move into 1920. And I expect exports to be similar to last marketing year.
No, as you and I were talking beforehand, I think what's really interesting, what farmers did with their flexibility with prevent plant acres is, given the trade problems and the big soybean yields and that 1 billion bushel carry, I like to call that they engaged possibly not in a joint action, but we effectively put in place about a 11 million acre soybean set aside through our corn PP this year.
Yeah,
they just took it all out.
Took it all out of soybeans.
So it's definitely going to be a help in the soybean balance sheet going forward.
It is, but we're always going to have to contend with that over a billion bushel carry out this marketing year, and I think we're going to eat through a substantial amount of that.
That's the one part of the surprise that I do see.
Yeah. So right now for 1920, Wazzy's got it at 7.9 million harvested acres at a 48.5 yield, which puts production at about 3.7 billion bushels, carrying in that 1.07 billion. We're looking at a total supply of about 4.77 billion bushels. Right now they've got crush at 2.115 billion and exports at 1.775. Yesterday they lowered exports 100 million bushels. I was glad to see that because I don't know in what plane they were thinking we were going to expand exports 175 million bushels under current trade scenarios. So they got a total consumption of about 4 billion bushels and a carry out of 755. Basically, under USDA's projections, soybean prices are flat, marketing year to marketing year. Now, where we differ strongly from the USDA is the yield. I think 46.5, which is 2 bushels below USDA, is one projection that I have in my models. And I don't know, Scott, where you're at, but it could be at 48.5. But it just seems with that amount planted late and the way this crop's gotten off to a start, the yield penalties are substantial for late planting soybeans. So we'll see how it turns out. 46.5 would put us at about a 3.5 billion bushel production. Carrying in puts us at about a 4.6 billion supply. I'm a little lower on crush and a little lower on exports. I can see some expansion of exports this year to non-Chinese markets. It looks like we're in place over the next marketing year for a similar look for exports for soybeans under the current trade scenarios.
Yeah, I think one thing we would want to add is when we put these balance sheets together, Todd and I's assumption is that we're not attaching any chance of a major trade deal. And, that is, there's some risk that we could be wrong, but we're factoring in no trade deal.
Yeah, I've got it at about a 0 probability. Now, that could be wrong. I know we're talking about negotiations in September, but one of the dangers, and we're starting to see it trickle through the world economy, is a general recession next year. If that comes in place, we could be in for a rough year for soybeans, exports-wise.
But that's one of our maintained assumptions.
Maintained assumptions, no trade deal. So we got a consumption under the 46.5 yield. They're the same, 3.9 billion bushels. It really comes down to how much we supply is how much we're going to eat out of those ending stocks. Under the 46.5, I've got ending stocks at 668, which is about a 16.9% stocks to use, and I'd say 855 average farm price. If we see yield get down to 45.5, I'm looking at ending stocks of 592 and about 875 average farm price. One of the issues for both corn and soybeans this year is we're not really going to get a good idea about yield numbers probably until we get into October, November. Right. So any kind of rally is going to be a little bit delayed, which is not good for crop insurance prices in particular and harvest marketing. So we may be looking at a place, if we think the crop's short, to sort of carry the crop forward a little bit.
Just one more comment there's for farmers, if there is a silver lining to what was a very dark cloud hanging over the markets after yesterday's announcement, I really did not foresee the potential to make as much progress as it appears we might be able to make in eating away at that billion bushel carryover for soybeans.
No, yeah, we could eat through, 800 million.
Half of it in a year.
Yeah, easy.
But that does then, it'll still be a relatively large carryover that presents a problem. What's going to happen to soybean acres next year after this huge drop?
Well, the acreage next year, this is all speculative right now, but there's a lot of talk about 98, 100 million corn acres next year. That looks like it's off the table, right? You could probably see acres relatively flat, maybe some expansion of soybean acreage, some reduction of corn acreage in 2020. And so will that hurt? It's basically a scenario of flatter prices over the long run for both crops.
Yep.
When we look at basis for soybeans has been atrocious this year. This is also from South Central Illinois. It's strengthened recently, and you may see it strengthen a little bit more, but we're still looking at a 35 to 40 under for most of the marketing year, maybe under a best case scenario. So keep that in mind when you're marketing beans this year, unless we just get a devastating yield, like crazy low yield. There's some carry in the market, much like in corn. We've seen soybean prices move up 6 cents this morning. Basically, if you had success with a marketing plan last year, you may be looking at it again this year in the same way. That's how I see it breaking out. I'm trying to get through. We're a little bit over. We're willing to take questions and happy to take questions. And you can find the downloads at www.farmdoc.illinois.edu/webinars. And so let's get to the questions. This is my favorite part.
All right. I think we just got to hit this one head up, Todd.
Yeah.
Again, because this is the big issue that came out. I thought this question really framed it nice. The first one is, why do the reported planted acres and the prevented planted acres add up to numbers that seem impossible? You want to take that, Todd?
Well, we've been discussing it. Yeah. If you thought when we were moving into June, it's basically, it looks like to me in large parts of the Corn Belt that the prevent planted corn acres stole soybean acres. And that's why they look impossible.
Right.
I mean, technically, is that supposed to happen? They went ahead and planted the corn and then PP'd acres.
Corn acres out of soybeans.
Corn acres out of soybeans.
And you could do that because of the flexibility built into the prevent plant provisions of the crop insurance.
That's correct.
It's not based on what you intended to plant this year. There's a maximum prevent plant acreage that's based on your maximum corn acres in your insurable unit, I believe, over the last 4 years.
4 years.
And so that gave farmers a lot of flexibility in how they chose to take their prevent plant.
Correct.
You could take more prevent plant than you would predict based on what their intentions were.
Correct.
And so I think that's the key. And that's what farmers did. If you believe the USDA numbers, which we basically do, that's the story.
That's the story. That's the only way you square this thing. And it makes sense when you look at the numbers, like in our slide, when you look at corn and soybean acres total over the last 2 years.
And what it implies is that a lot more corn was planted in June. That's what it gets down to, than we expected, given prices and what we know about from my agronomic data about planting date penalties.
Correct.
Farmers pushed corn planting harder in June than we expected.
Yeah,
That's what it comes down to.
much more than we expected.
So, let's see. Says quickly, will this webinar be recorded and available? Yep. Go to the download page. And will this be applicable to areas outside of Illinois? We hope so. Let's see. Says you guys have more access to the USDA guys than most people. Why did they reduce corn acres in the June WASDE, which is unprecedented, 3 weeks before the survey? It changed the whole momentum of the market, manipulation of the highest order, I would say. My response is I truly don't believe the USDA attempts to manipulate. I think that in that June WASDE, WASDE folks were just trying to get out in front of what virtually everybody, including Todd and I, thought was going to be a sharp drop from the March intentions in planted and harvested acres for corn. So that's mine. Todd, how certain are we of the remaining 50% of the MFP payments in your opinion?
I'm pretty confident that they're going to go out. How about you? I would be shocked if they didn't go out.
Yes, I'd say based on the current price levels, everything going on, I would say a near the chance of that happening is close to 100%. I think this is a really interesting question. Did the MFP confusion at planting time cause farmers to favor corn over soybeans due to farm base issues?
So
that's an interesting question.
That is a good question. I think the MFP announcement played a part in this. I do believe that. When it came out on May 31st. And for a couple of weeks there, the secretary and a lot of USDA officials were saying you have to plant to get this MFP payment, right? You have to plant.
Yep.
I can't see that not having some kind of effect on the decision, right? How much, it's hard to parse out, but I believe it had some kind of impact on it.
Right. And so, and the impact that it had was, I think farmers said, if I'm going to have to plant something, I prefer to plant corn. So the flexibility that the MFP2 program had, where it was decoupled from what you planted, but it was coupled to planting or versus prevent plant.
That's correct.
Now, the irony is that may turn out not to be true, because there was $15 per acre for prevent plant in the MFP2 final rules, and now we've got money allocated for prevent plant acres in the supplemental disaster program. You know, I've been on record. I think when it's all said and done, that the prevent plant acres will get close to what planted acres get for their extra supplemental payments. So definitely a very interesting situation. Here's a question, like a lot of people. It says, I am astounded by this report. I don't even know what to ask. How can so much of the crop be planted exceedingly late, endure much less than desirable growing conditions to date, and still pull off a national corn yield of 170? Question mark, question mark, question mark. What do you think, Todd?
Question mark here as well. We agree with that assessment.
I think that those were, in our view, pretty optimistic yield projections for both corn and soybeans.
Yeah.
Okay. Please address cost competitiveness of Brazil as a soybean supplier to China and the world. At these bean prices, we would expect many acres to be unprofitable due to Brazil's much higher cost to port due to poor logistical infrastructure. What do you think?
Well, I think based on the way the trade deal is falling out, if China is going to source beans, they're probably going to South America, and that may be independent of, you see a gap form between the Brazilian port price and the U.S. price. Now, will that make us more competitive in non-Chinese markets? Yes, it will. but China is such a massive buyer of soybeans on the world market. I mean, that's why we got 1.7, slightly above that for exports. That's everybody else. We also have to always remember that African swine fever is decimating the hog herd in China. The demand in general might be lower, and it'll push, soybean buying down a little bit, even though they've said they're going to buy 5% more. Kafka said 5% more out of Brazil over the next few months. So I think we're going to be very competitive in the rest of the world market. It's hard to make up for China. That's it.
Question about trade estimates, and it says when the trade price is in, this estimate is the average of these guesses. What's priced in? That's a really interesting question, and most generally we assume that the market's pricing in the average of those guesses. I've done some recent research actually on that, and it shows that these trade estimates are pretty noisy.
Yeah.
And they're really best considered guesstimates, and they're only a rough guide to how the market's going to react, but that's the basic idea. Question is corn and bean price outlook for the rest of the marketing year, plus current status and likely future soybean sales to China, and when will the market be pricing in the risk of a trade deal being made? Another excellent question.
I think the market sort of got chicken littled on trade deals, and it's going to be a when they see it kind of scenario. I don't know if they're going to fall for another, we've got really good conversations going, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, oh no, it didn't work out. I think you're going to have to see. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a lot of speculation around a trade deal unless something really firm comes out. You might disagree with that, Scott, but how many times are they going to be fooled by a possible trade deal? Maybe another time. I don't know. We'll see in September when
it's very clear with the events on the trade war with China front that both sides are digging in.
Yeah.
This looks like a classic kind of political trench warfare where the trenches are being built on both sides. They're dug in. The only event that I think that could change that dynamic is that there is a presidential election coming up next year, and that may put pressure from the U.S. side to get some kind of deal made. But that goes against what, both sides seem to be locked into waiting this out for the long run.
Yeah.
Question is again similar. How can acreage be so high? Does this acreage include cover crop as well? If that's the case, USDA numbers are incorrect on the harvest yield. And I think again we would tend to agree with that conclusion because what it implies about the number of acres planted in June for corn and soybeans. Another acreage question. How can you prevent plant that many corn acres? Prevent plant is based off prior history of planted corn acres. According to RMA guidelines, that should not be possible. Prevent plant is only available in the largest number of acres planted in the past 4 years. So in other words, it is an interesting question. How do we get to a total base? We supposedly planted 90 million acres of corn, actually, PP'd 11.2, so the total is 101.2 million acres. In other words, I think what you can get fooled by is by looking at the maximum aggregate acreage of corn in the last 4 years.
Yes.
Because and not realize how much additional the total maximum can go up if each farm maximizes their prevent plant acres. It's larger than the maximum of total corn acres in the last 4 years. Am I saying that right? Can you help me explain that better, Todd? I think I'm drowning.
It's tough to explain, right? I'm going to drown trying to explain it too, because it's a little bit confusing to think about how these acreage can move around, right? How can you take and PP some acres that maybe you were intending to be soybeans, but you're saying they're corn acres, right?
Right.
But it's not acre to acre. Like nobody's tracking every acre on your farm. Like that's a corn acre this year, that's a soybean acre this year, right? So there's a fungibility to how you move your acres around. Is that all right?
Basically, the bottom line is there's more flexibility on the total potential base of planted corn acres plus PP than you realize, because you can optimize the total number of corn plus PP acres is larger than I think people realize when you build it up farm by farm by farm.
In units.
In units, yeah. I don't know. I think we failed on that.
Yeah, we did.
We're just going to move on. We failed.
USDA apparently, here's a question. USDA didn't show smaller percent of corn acres harvested even though late planting. Comment. So there's a gap between planted and harvested acres this year of about 8 million acres. Now that's slightly higher than on average over the last 20 years. And I think, we were saying earlier, you could start seeing that creep up 1 to 2 million acres before it's all said and done. But in the survey, they ask harvested acres for grain in the survey.
Right.
And so I think they're probably pretty close. Any kind of creep in that would be limited in what we said before, a couple million acres possibly out of that. So.
Oh my gosh, we can't avoid it down here. Can you explain again your assumptions around the shift between soybean, PP, and corn? Is the assumption that PP was claimed on soy and corn planted on those acres? No. It's like a farmer started off intending to plant 1,000 acres of corn, went and talked to his crop insurance agent and said, on your farm, you can claim prevent plant on up to 1,300 acres this year because of your acreage pattern in the past. So I'm going to plant my 1,000 acres of corn. I'm going to PP 300 acres of corn. But of course, those 300 acres had to come out of somewhere in terms of your original planting intentions. And they didn't plant. They ended up not planting those to soybeans. So effectively, when we say that, we don't want anybody to think that farmers were literally cheating by PPing soybean acres somehow against the rules. It's just the flexibility built into the rules.
Yeah.
I think I got to stop on that one.
Yeah, we just need to stop trying to explain that one.
I am a bit surprised by, where did that go? Man, there's a lot of questions here. We're never going to get through them, are we? What will be the potential implications for ethanol and biodiesel production? Well, I think that probably the biofuels industry is wiping their brow and have a big sigh of relief on what happened yesterday. I think they can deal with whatever price increases might result from this modestly for soybean oil, and we're not looking at any explosive corn price scenarios unless we're even more wrong on yield than we expect. So I think that probably that's good news for them.
Yeah.
Did you compare final yields in 93 and 95 versus the August estimates? Seems relevant as they have comparable revenue. I think you made that point.
Yeah, they were much lower, 12 and 21 bushels. Now, things have changed. I'm not saying we're going to see a 20 bushel yield drop in corn, but that's what we showed. Here's something about soybean crush capacity. We've added a few crush facilities over the last year. I'm not certain on what the actual nameplate capacity is right now. He said, do you see a possibility of more than 2.1 billion bushels crushed? Yes, I do. Why am I limited at 2.1 billion bushels? It has to do with economic. It has to do with growth in some of these places. Argentina back on board with their soybean crush. Now we did get some I would consider it decent news out of Argentina with their primary the other day and Macri losing by a lot and going back to more of a Perona style government in Argentina. That may be more supportive for soybean meal exports, but that may be a year out. So I'm a little bit less on crush than USDA. Is there a potential to go to 2.2 billion? Yes, I think there is, but I don't see it happening this year.
Here's I think an interesting question as we're starting to run out of time, and we thank you everyone for all of your very interesting questions. Given the positive corn basis levels at most of Iowa's ethanol plants the past several months, could the 2018 USDA corn yield have been overstated as many producers believe based on their farm harvested yields? I think that's going to be a potentially interesting issue, and we will learn the answer to that, I believe, with the September 30th stocks report. We had, some unusually high basis levels across much of the corn belt for corn. Does that signal that the farmers develop very bullish price expectations and we're just holding stocks off the market that were really there? Or are the stocks not quite as large because the 2018 corn crop was overestimated? I mean, I think, both of those are plausible, and I tend to lean towards that the stocks are really there. What about you?
I think we saw some speculation on people's stocks based on what we thought was going to happen in the corn market in 2019.
Last year, USDA did pretty well with their yield forecast. Do you know if they used field survey or imagery? For August, and it is an important point, for yield, in the past, they've always used two surveys: an objective yield in-field measurement based on an area frame survey, and a farm operator survey, just asking farmers what their yields are. They did not do that this year. No. We don't know how much they relied on satellite imagery. Probably more than in the past, but how much more, we don't know.
No idea.
And so there's no way to really tell, but we know that, the research on statistical forecasting says that when you have one less indicator than you've used in the past, you should expect less accuracy. How much, we don't know, but I think that gives us some scope to also support our view that there's room for that yield number to go down.
I think so.
A lot of people are helping us out on our drowning on the explaining. This is a great point. I want to repeat it. Whoever made it, thank you. That the national acre max for corn may be different than the individual farm acre maximum.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
We really appreciate that. You bailed us out.
Yeah.
I am in the opinion the thought of higher insurance prices led to more corn planting. What do you think? That would be the $4 February price.
I think there were a lot of things going on into May, early June that led to more corn planting. It's insurance. It was weakness in the soybean price. You started to see the corn price strengthen, the market facilitation payments announcements. There's just a lot going on right there. And I don't know how to disentangle all of it, to be honest with you.
The person said, I'm curious about the NASS acreage resurvey for July. I was not resurveyed. I think it says in June, maybe means July. Any thoughts? That is an interesting question, because the resurvey was based on the area frame, not the list frame, which is the farm operator survey. But it's complicated, but it still means they probably talked to someplace on the order of 25 or 30,000 farm operators going through the June area survey approach that they use. So again, Todd and I have confidence in those acreage numbers, that they don't have any more than the normal error than we would see with the June acreage survey now. That's our position.
That's my position. I think
Oh, we're running out of time, aren't we, Jim? Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
It's Jim's birthday.
Yeah, I don't want to kill Jim's birthday, but
Yeah. Do you have plans, Jim?
FarmDoc.
All right.
right.
Oh man, we got to help you out. How do you think about China's demand for soybeans at 103 million metric tons flat year to year, with some news talked about a 40 to 50% drop in China's hog herd sound? Does this sound realistic?
I don't know what China's herd size is, and if anybody knows for sure, let me know. Could it be 40, 50%? It sure could. Some of the reports I've seen is 30% of the sow herd's down, 20 to 30% in 19, another 10%. From what I've heard, and this is anecdotal, they've got a lot of recurrences of swine fever and repopulated lots, and they've sort of cleared out some of the more smaller operators. It doesn't seem realistic to me. I think you could see China's soybean demand come down a little bit. Their imports, I think USDA's got them at 87, 88 million metric tons. China's talking 83 million metric tons. And I don't see us getting a lot of that under current trade scenarios.
One more I'd really like to, someone wrote in more of a comment. It says, old rule, buck the USDA at your own risk. They have had two chances to give us a more favorable report and have frustrated us twice. Then this farmer said, that just doesn't jibe with what we see. Are they that much more disciplined and smarter? I'm not going to say that, but I do think that they're very good at what they do, particularly when they can count things like acreage at this point in the season.
Yeah.
And as painful as that might be to consider at this point in terms of the market price, I still think that, like I said, our position on acreage it's within now normal error bounds for what we would have normally considered in June.
That's right.
1 or 2 million acres. I saw a question on here. Someone asked, do you think were corn economics so much better versus beans on June 1st that it justified the farmers' actions? Now, that's a loaded question to end on, Todd.
It is. Because you can't take the agronomics out of the economics, in my opinion.
You should patent that.
You can't take the agronomics out of the economics. Trademark, Hubs. But if you're just looking at price, yeah. And if you're thinking about, well, I've got revenue protection insurance and, at a minimum, it's going to be 401 if my yield's off 25%. There's a lot of calculations there. But the work that Gary Schnitke did looking at prevent plant on corn and the break-evens with soybeans, even under higher prices, when you broke the numbers down, it looked like PP on corn was the right decision. So I don't think you should take the agronomics out of the economics, but if you're just looking at price, maybe.
Again, this is my answer to that is I was personally surprised that we didn't have 2 million acres of prevent plant corn for corn in Illinois, and we only got 1.1 million. And I attribute that to, again, farmers in Illinois having some combination of more bullish price expectations than the futures market was signaling during that crucial June planting window, and or expectations on the agronomics of a smaller yield penalty than, for example, Gary Schnitke was including in his assessment of the economics of these choices.
And much smaller than I use when I think about it as well.
That's right. The research that I've looked at says if you're going to plant corn after June 10th, to the 20th of June in this part of the Corn Belt, you're looking at a minimum of 25%, and you would want to probably calibrate in maybe more like a 1/3 to 40% drop in yields. But then this is all water under the table now. We're going to find out if that agronomic evidence is right. And if it's right, then the USDA's 169.5 on corn and 48.5 on soybeans is too high.
Right. And if the USDA is right, we're going to be readjusting our trend forecast.
Yeah.
Yep.
So gonna learn a lot this year.
We are gonna learn a
We've
lot.
gone over time. We couldn't get to all of the many questions that came in. We apologize for not getting to everybody's questions. But we thank everybody for tuning in, and you can find the slides at our downloads page that's shown on the screen. Again, thank you everyone, and have a good week.
Have a good week.